Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Monsignor Walter Rossi, who is rector of the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception, I'm Monsignor Vito Bonanno, the Shrine's Director of Pilgrimages, and pleased to welcome all of you to the first presentation of the Shrine's 2024 Lenten Reflection Series, offered tonight by Reverend Brother Kevin Smith. Brother Kevin is a Franciscan friar of the Third Order Regular and is currently a transitional deacon belonging to the province of the Most Sacred Heart of Jesus. Born in Tampa, Florida, Brother Kevin entered the Franciscans in 2017 and professed vows in 2019. He is currently finishing up his studies at Catholic University and will be ordained a priest later on this year. As a member of a religious community inspired by the penitential work of St. Francis of Assisi, Brother Kevin's talk this evening is aptly focused on the power of the cross of Christ and how we, Jesus' disciples today, are called to follow him in this holy and penitential season of Lent and always. Brother Kevin's presentation is entitled, "Take up your cross and follow me, St. Francis of Assisi and the Stations of the Cross." Please welcome Brother Kevin Smith.
Thank you. It's good to be here with you all this evening. Hope you all are enjoying your first week of Lent. Hope it's going to be a fruitful season for all of you. Every Lent, most parishes will do some sort of Stations of the Cross event of some kind. And though a lot of us are probably familiar with the practice, with the devotion, very few of us probably know the origins of the event, of the devotion. So to help us enter into that devotion a little bit more, I'm going to offer a little bit of a history lesson, so hopefully you signed up for a history lesson, and also a couple of reflections on some of the stations, not all of them, to maybe help us enter a little bit more into the Stations of the Cross, especially during this Lenten season. So, as we all know, St. Francis is one of the more popular saints of the Church. After having a very deep encounter with God, he saw the pointlessness of the world and chose to follow God in an extremely radical way. He gave up a very promising youth and very promising future career in the cloth business with a very wealthy family, and led a very austere life, following God, especially in poverty. Since Christ had nowhere to lay his head and lived a very poor life, Francis insisted that him and his followers live the same way. And everything Francis did, he wanted to be completely and totally conformed to Christ and to every part of Christ's life. So at some point after he had this encounter with God, St. Francis was living this very austere, very radical, very poor life. And he started to begin to attract the attention of the other people in Assisi. It's a very small town. And if you're from a small town, D.C. is not really a small town, but if you're from a small town, you know that people like to talk, and they will recognize each other, and they're going to talk real quick about you. So people began to make fun of him. They said, "Look at this guy. He thought he was so cool. He was the life of the party before, and now he found God, and he's doing these weird things. He was a holy fool." And St. Francis took this in stride, thinking, if Christ suffered all these torments and muttering, then I can suffer this too, just like he did on the cross. But after a while, St. Francis attracted a little bit more positive attention. People saw that despite this outward show of what seemed foolishness to them and craziness, he was actually very sane. And the interior disposition or the interior change that had happened was genuine. It wasn't this sudden onset of dementia or insanity, but it was something very real and abiding that had happened and had changed. He was doing everything dressed in rags. He was helping lepers. He was rebuilding churches. He wanted to give back in some way to God after having fallen in love with God. And everything he did came from a place of that love for God. And he wanted to pay God back, and he wanted to show that love that he had experienced. And people began to notice that. And after giving up everything that he had before, the military career, the cloth business of his family, he attracted that positive attention I was speaking about. And people came to this different conclusions. Some continued to think he was crazy, and some thought differently and said, if this guy, this life of the party, this, the equivalent of like a frat guy, can follow God in this way, maybe I can too. So before long, Francis had a number of people that were attracted to his way of life and began to do what he was doing, rebuilding churches, helping lepers, giving back to God in whatever way, and living a very poor and austere life. And it wasn't really in his plan to have these followers. He was thinking, I don't really know what to do with people following me. I'm just trying to do what God is asking me to do. In his testament, where he does a little mini autobiography of his life, he says almost laconically, the Lord gave me brothers, and there was no one to tell me what to do. So he was very, very unprepared and felt like, okay, these people are looking to me for guidance. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. So he went to the priest of the local parish to seek from God himself what to do. And they opened the Bible up to seek that guidance. And so that what they did, him and his first followers went to the parish church, and they did something that the church doesn't really recommend you do. And they just opened up the Bible 3 times to see what God had to say to them. And this Bible that they opened up is actually a missal that we would use in the liturgy. And that missal is actually available in Baltimore. You can go and look at it in the Walter Museum of Art in Baltimore. So it's kind of cool. A couple of us brothers went to see that missal right before COVID started, and it was a really cool experience. And you can still see it now. So what they did is they opened up that missal 3 times to see what God had to say to them. And those 3 verses formed the basis of the Franciscan order and are the verses that every Franciscan tries to live his life after. So the first verse was from Mark. Jesus spoke to the rich young man and said, "Go, sell what you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come, follow me." The second verse was from Luke. Take nothing for the journey, neither walking stick, nor sack, nor food, nor money, and let no one take a second tunic. And the third verse, the most important one, whoever wishes to come after me must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. And all 3 of these verses speak to the necessity of following Jesus completely, totally, and radically, taking up your cross, taking no walking stick, not even a second tunic for the journey, and especially deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. And Francis decided to take these verses completely literally. He formed with himself and his first followers a tunic in the shape of a cross. So that's why Franciscans, we wear this. That's why the sleeves are ridiculously long. It's supposed to be in the form of a cross. So to remind us, take up your cross and follow me. And this becomes a major theme, take up your cross and follow me, in the life of St. Francis. And because for him, and really for all Christians, the cross is an ultimate expression of God's love for humanity. Francis would be so upset by the apathy, the indifference that people had for the love of God displayed on the cross, that he was often found crying randomly. And when he was asked, "Why are you crying?" he said, "Because love is not loved," meaning that so many people are treating the death of Christ as if it's just another part of their day, just another Tuesday. They don't really care about it. And all the implications that come with it, they were also casting aside. How much he cared for us, how he didn't want heaven without humanity. So he endured the cross, but we still ignore it, even those of us who consider ourselves to be good, devout Christians. And Francis had this insane love for Christ and desire to have everyone that he encountered come to knowledge and to know Christ as intimately as Francis did. So he took this love that he had for God to the Holy Land and wanted to evangelize the Muslims that had taken over the Holy Land and that the Crusades at the time were attempting to win back. So his plan was to either go to the Holy Land and evangelize the Muslims and win the Holy Land back and establish peace in the Holy Land, or to die a martyr. And that was really a win-win situation in his book. I guess fortunately for us, unfortunately for him, he was unsuccessful in both of those things. He did not die a martyr, and he also did not convert the entire Holy Land to Christianity. But he was successful in getting a relationship going between the local Muslim population and the later friars. And the later friars were allowed to take care of the Holy Land sites, both by the Pope, that Francis had ingratiated himself to, and also the Muslims, who he had also won a good relationship with. And so the Franciscans still to this day take care of the Holy Land. If you go to the Holy Land Monastery, it's that group of Franciscan friars that take care of it. So at that time in the Holy Land, and even to today, there's a popular devotion called in the Holy Land the Via Dolorosa, where pilgrims would follow as best as they knew, as best as the evidence that they had available, where they would follow the path of Jesus on Good Friday from either the Garden of Gethsemane or from the condemnation by Pilate, all the way to Calvary, ending in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And because at the time, a lot of people were coming in and out of the Holy Land on pilgrimages, on military campaigns, there was a lot of contact with the Holy Land and its practices, and people began to bring back some of those practices, including the friars, especially the friars. So the friars started to set up in their churches, when they would come back to Europe, different stations of the cross. And so they would imitate the Via Dolorosa that they found in the Holy Land and bring it to the churches that they ran back in Europe, to help people to experience the experience of the Holy Land if they could not afford a pilgrimage, or if they just were not able to go, because they wanted everyone to experience the things that they experienced in the Holy Land and enter more deeply into the Passion of Christ. And that continues to today. All of us, all of our churches, or many of our parish churches, continue to have the Passion of the Christ, or Passion of the Cross, available to all of us in the Stations of the Cross. So if you're in the parish, or if you're in your parish and you see someone doing the Stations of the Cross, maybe you can join them a little bit, and I'll offer a couple of reflections just based on some of the stations to maybe help us enter into a little more deeply into those stations if you happen to pray them this Lent. And there's, again, like I said, there's many different iterations. Some are going to start at the agony of the garden and continue all the way to the crucifixion, or the laying of Jesus' body in the tomb. Some will end with the resurrection on Easter Sunday. Some with the ascension. They're all just different iterations of this. But when we encounter the part of Jesus' passion where he is experiencing the condemnation by Pilate, we place ourselves in Jesus' position, and we can reflect on that horrible miscarriage of justice and how he was the one who established justice and will establish justice. And every single earthly leader that we know and love or hate has been put on their throne by Jesus, including by Pilate. And in that moment, Pilate was misusing that authority. We enter into that reality that Jesus was one who experienced a miscarriage of justice, a misuse of authority. And we might think in our own lives of the difficulties that we face, certain miscarriages of justice in our own lives. My boss made a very poor decision, and now my family is impacted in this way or that way. The government is doing something crazy that I don't really like, and it's going to impact those I love in this or that way. We bring these experiences and these difficulties to Jesus, and we offer them along with him to imitate his docility to God's will. God put those people in charge for his own mysterious reasons. And we also imitate his quiet hope in the future that when these things that have gone wrong, at some point they're going to be righted. The station where Jesus receives his cross, we can remember that the verse that Francis opened the missal to, "Take up your cross and follow me." We know that Jesus is not a tyrant telling people to do this thing, take up your cross, this horrible thing, while he sits in the other room in a nice, comfortable little chair, but he's doing the exact thing that he tells us to do, taking up his cross and leading the way that we're supposed to follow. And that's how we imitate him, is by taking on these hardships of life and walking with them, with Jesus. And we offer those with Jesus. We say, I'm not going to understand or really hope to understand some of these things that happen, but I'm going to walk with Jesus on them. Jesus isn't going to give us an answer most of the time for the suffering that we experience, at least not immediately. And that wasn't really the purpose of the cross, to give an answer, but to give us a hope for a future with Jesus where he experiences death on the cross, but also resurrection later on. And at each of the three falls along the way, we can think of the difficulty of the crosses that each and every one of us carries. Jesus struggled to carry his cross, and according to this tradition, he fell 3 times. But each time he got back up. In getting back up, we can think of his determination to continue on with our salvation. From the very beginning, he was determined to complete that task of salvation. And I like to think of him focusing very intently. Every time he's falling, he's not focused on his weakness or on how difficult the thing is, but on the very end goal, dying for us and for our salvation. And we remember this when we fail the tasks that God has set before us. We think, I cannot do this. God, you want me to do this. I don't know why you had me do this, but I get up, dust myself off, and keep going, even though it is difficult, knowing that God has called me to do this. And I don't let the end goal, which is love of God, union with him, I don't let that be clouded by anything else that's coming up. Skipping ahead to the fifth station, we might hear Simon of Cyrene, and he's forced to carry the cross with Jesus. The difficulty of carrying that cross was so difficult that someone else, another human, had to take care of the cross with him. I also think sometimes of Simon, who he was unexpected that he would carry the cross. He might have just been walking by like, what on earth am I being asked to do right now? That happens to us a lot of times too. Something insane happens. I didn't expect this disease to come along. I didn't expect this illness. This cross that I'm experiencing right now, I wasn't expecting it, and I don't want it. But Simon wasn't expecting that cross, and maybe I can carry that cross with Jesus and continue that with the same determination as before, just like Jesus had in his own ordeal, even though he was expecting his. Jesus comforts the women of Jerusalem, and we can hear in his words of comfort to the women, words of comfort to us along our way, whether it's, again, crosses that are unexpected, like a sickness that came out of nowhere, or maybe a job situation that was not planning for this, a financial situation. I'm not going to recover from this or that financial situation. Or maybe the expected things, taking on this Lenten sacrifice. I knew it was going to be hard, but I did it anyways, and I'm going to hear these words of comfort that Jesus gives me, persevering and not giving up, keeping my eyes on the end goal, union with God. And then fast forwarding a little bit to Jesus being stripped of his garments, that humiliation that must have entailed. For the Jewish people, they were very, very modest people. The cross was supposed to be a very humiliating and very brutal punishment. The Romans were experts, if in nothing else but in cruelty and humiliation and making people feel horrible. And the master of history, Jesus, he could have tweaked things in any way that he wanted to make it less humiliating, less painful. But really, if you look at it, it seems like he entered into that point in history where people were the most cruel, the most horrible to each other, wanting to cause as much pain and humiliation as possible. And he chose not to change history to make it more comfortable, but really enter into that awfulness that the cross entailed. And it really was a display of how awful humanity is to itself. There's no really better explanation than someone hanging on the cross to show us what sin does to us. It tears us apart. It makes us less human. It makes people want to look away, and it humiliates us. Because when we see our own sins stripped away, the nice part of sin kind of looks nice sometimes. When we see that stripped away on the cross, we're confronted with the reality, and we're thinking, I do not want to do this anymore, because not only does it look like that, but it separates me from Christ himself. But he chose to endure this humiliation to show us, again, the impact of sin and how horrible the human heart can be to its fellow human. But it also shows us that no human being is that far from God's mercy. His most merciful moment was there on the cross, when it seemed like every little ounce of humanity had left. He was still there, exercising his most merciful act. And then we also experience our own humiliations, whatever it might be. Sometimes we go through life and we feel exposed by being humiliated at work. Something crazy happens. It feels like I am just being left out to dry. And we remember that Jesus experienced this on the cross, and his clothes were removed and he was put there on display for everyone. So again, Jesus has experienced everything that we experience, the horrible cruelty of human beings, and also the resurrection that comes at the very end. And then when Jesus is nailed to the cross, I think of the movie that Mel Gibson directed a few years back, or I guess it's probably 20 years ago now, that when Mel Gibson directed the movie, he has a faceless hand, or a hand, you don't see any other part of the person, driving the nails into Jim Caviezel's hand. It's, the actor that played Jesus. And it was actually Mel Gibson's hand that were driving those nails into Jim Caviezel's hands. And he did that to represent that it is all of us that have nailed Jesus to the cross by our sins. And again, Jesus could have done anything he wanted to just not allow this to happen, but he didn't. So when we think of the nails piercing his body, we might feel sorrow for our sins and desire to sit with Jesus in that difficulty and say, I'm sorry, Jesus, for my sins and for what I have done. Help me to not sin against you anymore in this way, because every time I sin, I put another nail or another wound into your side. And then finally, with Jesus dying on the cross, we remember God has created all of humanity, all the good of humanity, all the good in the world, and it's us humans that have messed it up. Justice says that we could not be in his presence because we have messed it up, and logic says that there's nothing we can do to pay back that mess up that we have done. But God decided to pay that debt in a way that we could never have done it, and not really give us an answer for all that suffering, but show us both the very depths of human sin and distance from God, but also the depths of his mercy. As stubborn as sin and humanity is, God's mercy is 20 times more stubborn than sin could ever be. And now we live in a very sanitized world too. The world that tells us we don't want to see gross things. Everything has to be clean. We have to polish everything very, very well. So people will often ask, why did it have to be this way? Why did it have to be so bloody, so gross, so cruel? And the answer to that is that's just the reality that we're living in. And it didn't have to be that way, but we ourselves made it that way. And God entered into that fact, that reality, that he was not repulsed by our sin, by our disgustingness that we bring into the world, but he entered into it, showed us what it looked like, but also said, I'm not afraid of this. I'm coming to bring you out of it. And that's what he does. He pulls us out. Even if we go back into that filth, the nastiness, the cruelty of sin, he brings us out 20 times if we go into it 20 times. So thus, as we journey through Lent, we might consider these parts of the stations and the history of the stations and maybe enter more deeply into the experience of the cross. For many people throughout the centuries, they've fallen in love with God over and over and over again as they pray through the stations and they meditate on everything that God has done for us. As I said before, this meditation on Jesus and his love on the cross moved St. Francis to tears very often. And if we allow our own hearts to be moved by God's love for us and experience his passion in a very deep way, we can join that very, very long line of saints who have gone before us and have allowed Jesus' death to not be in vain, but have conformed themselves to Jesus' life, his passion and death in a very radical way that has changed their life and the life of those around them. So what if we go out here doing just that, conforming ourselves a little bit more every single day to Jesus' death on the cross during this Lent, and then in the Easter we can conform our lives to his resurrection. So thank you all for coming to this and for watching on the live stream. I hope that this Lent, and I pray that this Lent will be very blessed for all of you, and that God sends you exactly what it is that you need. Maybe it's not something that we want, but hopefully it is what we need for this Lent and for the rest of our lives. Thank you again.